Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. Dados have got to be considered a staple when it comes to furniture and cabinet construction. However, if you're new to this, not always easy, and even if you've got some experience, it can be tricky. I'm going to show you how to cut perfect dados on your table saw. Stay with me. We had a student in one of our previous training the hand classes. His name was Eric. And he was having a hard time cutting dados. Never had any instruction in it. Gave us the idea for making the video. And when I thought about it, if you've never had any training or any instruction at all on using a dado set to be set up and used to cut dados, it can be daunting, it can be dangerous. If you consider how much resistance there is pushing a piece of wood through your table saw with one blade, multiply that resistance by the number of blades you put in, which could be up to 7, and you realize there's a lot of force, and that has to be controlled. But if you do it and you do it right, you get great dados, and it's the fastest way I know of to cut a housing or a trench, whatever you want to call it, across the grain. You can also use it for cutting rabbets or grooves, but we're going to focus today specifically on dados. Now let's get the terminology correct so we can speak the same language. This is a dado set. It's a series of blades. I'll explain that in a moment. But it's designed to cut 3 primary joints. The first one is a dado. Some call it a trench, some call it a housing, but I'm going to use with North American terms, so it's a dado. And it is cut across the grain, and that's how that board grew in the tree. So across the length of the piece is a dado. This is a groove. It's cut parallel to the grain. Again, that's how the board came out of the tree. And then, of course, there's a rabbet or a rebate, and that's done on the edge. Okay, so those are the 3. We're going to focus on the dado. So when do you use it? Well, this is the side of a case, and this is probably the most common use. Its big advantage is that it's great in resisting shear force. So you put your cross piece in here. See if I can get it to fit. And it provides a tremendous amount of resistance to force going straight down like that. However, and I'll admit, be the first one to admit that I didn't expect this, we've done some testing on the gluing properties of this and found out it's extremely strong, stronger than I would have thought. And I'm going to tell you why I was surprised. Most of us have been raised to believe that end grain had no value when it came to glue surface or glue strength. And if you think about the way this goes together, every adjoining piece in this joint involves end grain. You've got the end grain of the piece coming across, touching the long grain at the bottom of the dado. You've got the end grain of the side touching the long grain of this piece. You've got the long end grain of that side touching this piece. So there really isn't any long grain to long grain glue surface. But just that alone, and a good joint, a good clean joint, will give you tremendous strength even with end grain. I prefer to support it somehow in addition to just glue strength, but the primary function of a dado in this application is to resist shear force acting on it like that, which means you don't have to make it very deep because you're relying on the strength of this piece, and it's going to take a tremendous amount of force to break it in that way. However, it can also give you a lot of strength against racking if it's used properly. But primary reason for a dado is a horizontal shelf or a divider, something like that on a piece of furniture. I'm going to give you what I would consider to be the 3 most common ways to cut a dado. I'm going to share with you the pros and the cons as I see it. First is going to be a router. Now, first the pros. You can take the tool to the wood. If you've got a large panel that you're trying to cut dados in, and you're working by yourself in particular, it's sometimes hard to manage that on the table saw. As long as you have the ability to clamp a fence, and by that I mean something secure that you can then come in. Now I added a base like that to mine just to make it so I had more reference surface. But you've got your router bit, you'd set it in there, that nice clamp properly, and you can go across and cut that. That's probably the single biggest advantage. What I don't like about it is the fact that it's cutting all the way around, or at least halfway around. So the force acting on is not in any one direction, and you just have to be really careful. There's a lot of vibration. It's noisy. It's throwing dust everywhere. And it's not my favorite way of doing it by any stretch. Second way is doing it entirely by hand. And that's slow, requires a fairly high level of skill if you want to get it right, but it is doable and it's enjoyable. And what I would do is I would clamp a piece of material that has a straight edge onto there. I would take a crosscut saw, and if you're able to, you can just hold it plumb, or if you can't do that, you can always take another piece of lumber, approximately the same size, and just push against it. Now this would be clamped, and then saw, and that's going to hold your saw standing plumb, which will keep your sidewall nice and straight. And you can go through and cut the entire length. What I've done before is actually clamped a piece of wood on here so that it would only go down to a certain depth. So if you had a block clamped that was the length of the saw, when you touched right here, it would bottom out. So now you've got the same depth. Then you're going to move over to the other side and do the same thing. Now you've got two saw cuts with a lot of material to be removed in the middle. Not a bad idea to make one more cut down the middle of that waist, but at that point you now have to chisel it out. Now we're not going to try to use the chisel to get it to the exact depth, but we're going to use the chisel to remove the bulk of the material. You're chiseling across the grain, which is not difficult. You want to make sure that you have your bevel on the bottom side. If you have the bevel up, you have no way of controlling the depth of the cut. But if you have your bevel down, you can lever against that, and that will actually allow you to control the depth, and you can get rid of the bulk of the material. Then you're going to come in with a router plane, which is a very precise tool. Set it for the depth that you need, and you're going to move it forward and back up against each wall to make sure that you're nice and clean. And now you've got a great dado, nice straight walls, or plumb walls, flat bottom. It just takes some time. If you're doing this for fun and in pure enjoyment, I would suggest you do that. Now the third way is actually going to be a combination of a few of those things I just showed you, and that's to use your dado. I'm going to explain this in a minute, but there's a separate set of dado blades, 8-inch diameter, and you can adjust the width of your cut. What's nice about it, you get the entire joint cut in one pass. It's relatively easy to control, unlike the router that's throwing forces are acting on it in several directions. This one, you're fighting the resistance of the blade and you're pushing through this way. And as long as you're close to your fence, and if you're not, you use a miter gauge, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it gives you a nice clean cut as long as the blades are sharp. And it's best to have zero clearance. I'll talk about that too. But you get a nice cut that is parallel to the edge. Sides are parallel. But you still don't have the bottom perfectly clean. And one of the disadvantages to a dado is that it leaves little horns. The outside edges of each of the main blades are angled, so they cut a little bit deeper than the center section. And that's not a problem unless you're going to see it out here on the edge. So I always, after I've done that, I always take my router plane, set to this exact depth, and go in there and I'll just clean out that little bit of material in the middle, and it'll give me a nice square bottomed, uniform depth all the way. That, I think, is the best method and the most accurate method for cutting dados. Hey, if you like this video, we have more. Our newsletter has subscriber-only content, monthly discount on tools, and anything we bring out that's new, subscribers get first crack at it. Click on the link below. Let's get back to work. Okay, so let me explain this dado set. There's several different brands, and I really don't have a preference. This one was made by Systematic. I've had this for 40 years. Works great. Lasts a long time, simply because you don't cut a lot with it, so you know, it might get sharpened once every 5 years. So you have two outside cutters, and you can tell they're an outside cutter because the majority of the teeth are heading to one side. So that is going to be, if I was holding it like this, that would be the left side of the stack. You notice that there's a wide spot opposite of each other. And then you've got your other one, and this one is going to be just the opposite. The teeth are going to be pointing to the opposite side, so you know that's going to be the other side. Then you have 5 cutters. These are 1/8 of an inch each, and the carbide tooth is wider than the base. So there's something that you have to pay attention to that when you're putting it together. And I have 4 of those, and then I have a 1/16 inch, and that will allow you to make a finer adjustment. Now I also have shims, and some I've actually made. Some of these I've purchased. The brass ones actually have the size right on them. Actually, some of the paint is worn off, but you can go through and make adjustments. That's 20 thousandths of an inch. That's 16 thou. And then I made these out of shim stock, so paper is the easiest way to do it. Or cardstock, you just measure it. I think cardstock comes in at 5 thousandths of an inch. And you can just stack those as many as you need. I sometimes will put them in various places because remember that you have the body of the tool is not as wide as the tooth. So you can stack on both sides of that and it'll still cover, it won't end up leaving a space that's not cut because the extra width of the tooth covers on both. So what I'm saying is if I had two of these together like this, I can put quite a few shims in there before I end up with a gap in the wood as a result because they overlap because of the way they overhang. Okay, now when you put these on the arbor, and you need to be aware that you're not going to have a whole lot of arbor left to put the nut on, and sometimes it's best to leave that outside washer. So your table saw typically has 2 washers on either side of the blade. Mine's a fairly large one. With that dado stack, sometimes I leave this one off so that I have a little extra thread to catch that nut. But when you put this together, you've got to make sure that you put those teeth, obviously they all have to be heading the same direction, you got to put these teeth in that wide spot. If you don't, the teeth actually lay up against the body of the tool, and you see how that won't fit nice and flat. But if you move it over into here, that now sits nice and flat. And then as far as staggering these, you don't have to. You just want to make sure that make sure you never want to have part of it sitting up on the tooth. So as long as you clear that, you're fine. I usually don't care how they end up sitting in there, whether they're all in one end or whether they're spaced apart like this. It really doesn't matter. And then, of course, your last one's going to go on. And when the last one goes on, you have to make sure that, again, that sits right. You've also got to be careful here, too. You've got to make sure that the tooth behind the space doesn't get caught up on this. So there's not a whole lot of room in there in terms of where you can actually place this. From about there to there is all you've got. And if you're going to put your spacers, then obviously your spacers are going to go on the inside in between the two. That's the way you put it in place, and then you obviously put your nut in there. And you're trying to do all of this down inside the tool, so it's not always the easiest thing to do, but if you're careful, it's not terribly difficult. Because of the rising popularity of the SawStop, I'm going to go through and show you what has to be done with this one. There are 2 different cartridges for your SawStop. One for your regular blade, which is a 10-inch, and it needs to be adjusted. You need to pay attention to the owner's manual so that you get it the appropriate distance from the outside diameter of the blade. Now, I'm going to reach down in here. I got to remove that as well, that splitter, that'll be in the way. Unlock this. And take out this cartridge. After you've done it 100 times, it's easy. Now you can see the difference in the 2 cartridges. What you're having to do is compensate for the difference between a 10-inch blade and an 8-inch blade. So there's the height difference away from the spring that actually activates it. And then of course you've got a much wider section of aluminum that drives into the blade. So we've got to put that in place. Goes in the same way. You just line up your pins. Well, I said 100 times and it gets easier. Maybe 110. There. Put that pin back in place. Make sure you lock it. I won't let you turn the saw on if it isn't. Now, when you put these in place, you want to make sure that the teeth are cutting toward you, and you want to make sure that the teeth are pointed, in this case, to my left. So I'll set that on there. And I always want to be careful never to bump anything because it's carbide. Make sure that lays in there nice and tight. Now, depending on the width of your cut, if you're doing a standard 3/4, then you're going to use all of the 1/8-inch chippers, but not the 1/16. Remember to line that up with the wide spot, and I always put it in there and then just make sure that it sits nice and tight. And by a habit, I rotate that just a little bit before I bring the next one in. Make sure that one sits in there nice and tight. And go right around and do each one, always making sure that it sits nice and tight. And your second blade, of course, the teeth are all pointed to my right. Get your wide spot, carefully set that in there, and line that up with your chipper. And you can tell that everything is sitting nice and tight. Now I've got about 5/8 of an inch of the shaft sticking out there, which would be the entire width of the blade. And that's still probably enough to put the washer on. Not that it's that important, because this is not going to run out. Although there's not a lot there, but I think it's still enough to actually hold. Don't like bumping that. That's where it's nice to have small hands. Just before I tighten that with the wrench, I want to make sure that everything is in place, and then I would go ahead and snug it up. What I want to show you is how you get a shim in there. And let me take this apart, and then I'll explain to you why this is important. The problem is that if you're going to use shims, and in particular these brass shims, when you try to put them in place, they fall down into the threads on the shaft, and they won't allow that to tighten up properly. And you can see how this has happened in the past. You can see some marks on there. So what I found is if you put it in place and then turn it this way or clockwise, it's going to, and when I say turn, I said turn the whole thing, because it's going to cause it to wind in, tightening. Then I'll put this in place. I got to get that outside cutter lined up. It's easier to work with if it's right at the top. I can see it a little better. Put that in. Line that up. And then with the shaft not turning, I'll turn all the blades. And what that does, it tightens everything up, and it moves that little shim that has already fallen down into that slot, so that everything is uptight, and you're not keeping that spaced away from allowing everything to pull tight, because it's sitting in the slots of the thread, preventing it from coming in tight. And then you can go ahead and put your nut on, and Bob's your uncle. Now, in order to get this set just right, you can go in and use a micrometer. You can actually figure this out, and you can measure the exact width that you need, and then you can go in and you can actually space or measure across the edges of two outside teeth. This one and this one. I'd line them up so it would make it a little bit easier to do. But if you're really fussy, and you should be, it's always best to do test cuts first. So I would go ahead and get that all set up, put it together, and make a test cut. We'll do that. This is the piece that we're going to dado. This is the piece that we're going to put into a dado in this section of, this is poplar, by the way. So I want to get really close. You can measure with my measuring tape, but I want to get closer than that if you want a really good fit. So that measures almost right on 1/2 inch. I'm going to check it with the calipers, and it's actually a little bit more than. So it's, instead of 500 thou, it's 533. Now we got to figure out how we're going to come up with 533. Well, we've got an 1/8, and this one is a 1/4. So this is going to give us 3/8. This is going to give us 1/2. And we needed, I forgot already what we came up with. So we need about an extra 30 thou. So where are we going to get 30 thou? We can look at these shims. That's 20, that's 16, that's 31. And I'm thinking that would be really close. And I would actually venture to go ahead and try that. It's only 1 thou difference, and that certainly shouldn't make a big difference. Now, if I can, I'd like to put that shim on first, because you'll notice that there's a little, we're not it's a better chance of this sitting on and not dropping down into the threads because there's no threads right up tight against that. So that'll give me my spacer. We still have to get this one in the right spot on that wide spot created in the outside blade. We want all these cutters facing the same direction, obviously. I like to rotate it so I can see what I'm doing. And this. And then I can snug it up. Close my dust door, drop that handle down. Now we need to have an insert that's wide enough, and it's always best to have a zero clearance. Now that means you got to have several of these because every time you do it, you may end up having it just a little bit wider. The big advantage to a zero clearance is that it supports the wood fiber on both sides, right up against the blade, or in this case, this part of the throat, and that's your best bet, other than a really sharp blade, to prevent any splittering on here. But like I said, unless you can make your own threaded inserts, and I've done that in the past as well, you're having to buy a bunch of these because you're going to, as you can tell, this one started off 3/4, now it's quite a bit wider. So I need to bring that up, and you've got to get it to whatever depth that you want. We'll leave it right there and move it over. Now we'll get all this stuff cleared out, and then we'll make a pass and test that. As long as I've got lots of surface area here, and I'm close, the blade is close to the fence, I don't have any problem doing it this way. But if you're not comfortable, you can always bring in your miter gauge, and what I would do is just loosen this up, keep it tight to your fence, and then make it fit here before you snug it up. That's good to go. Now we lucked out, that's actually a pretty good fit. If you were trying to build something, you wouldn't want it much tighter than that. You have to pound it in place. If we needed to make any adjustment, it's just a matter of going in and playing with the spacer and going, if we needed to be a little bit smaller, we went 1 thou over. And if I had to make up that 30 thou, I'd end up with a 16 and add a 10, give me 26. And I actually would try that, be 4 thou under. And you just have to play around with it until you get it the exact fit that you want. But that would Let's do a quick recap on this. I want to go some of the safety features because there's some inherent danger in there that isn't immediately obvious until you start using it. First of all, if you're going to get a dado set, I would suggest you make yourself up a box like this. Nothing more than a couple of pieces of hardwood on the outside, cutting some slots in there and using some hardboard to separate it. It's nice to keep all this together. And I just have a screw on the outside, and I've already managed to lose some of these over the years, but hopefully you won't repeat my mistake. But then they're close at hand. I want to keep my table saw as free from clutter as possible. Seems to be very difficult. Okay. First thing you need to remember that the resistance that you're going to face when you're running a board through that is going to be multiplied by the number of cutters are in there. You get a fair bit of resistance when you're just making a cut with a single blade, times that by however many cutters there are, and you've got to be prepared for that. So I would never make a cut like this, way out here. If I'm close to the fence, then I don't always choose to use the miter gauge, as long as I have sufficient surface area here. When I say sufficient surface area, if I was cutting a dado in this, I would not do it like that. That's when you have to have the support of the miter gauge coming in and squeezing the board against the miter gauge so that there's no way that can go in there and twist on you partway through the cut. Now, under this circumstance, you continue to use your fence as a spacer as long as you've got your miter gauge and you've got it securely held. Now, you get too far away, or if the piece is too big, then what you've got to do is you've got to come in and you've got to fasten an auxiliary fence onto here. There's provisions made. There's 2 holes here that you can screw through. Now you've got much greater support. Make sure your miter gauge is nice and tight so that doesn't move on you. I always make sure that I do a test cut before I go in and actually do the final cuts, both to get the height just right and also to get the spacing of the cutters. And if you're doing a chest of drawers, I think it goes without saying, but you're going to take your 2 outside panels and you're going to set your fence, make one pass, make another pass. So you're always doing both pieces before you change this setup. That way, everything's going to come out nice and parallel. Get yourself a good dado stack. You definitely want ones that are carbide. They'll last so much longer. They stay sharp longer, and they cut nice and clean. As I said, this was a systematic. I don't even think they're available anymore, but there's still companies like Freud that make them and a few others. But this is the best way to cut nice, clean dados. And as I mentioned, I think it pays to have a tool like this, a router plane, that you can then go in and make sure or verify the depth of that groove that you've cut, or dado, every time, so that you don't end up assembling and finding that things don't close the way you thought they did. It's easy when you're running a big panel over that saw for that to lift up a little bit. Remember, the action of the saw is always pushing the board up, and not everybody wants to have their hand right on top of the board when the blade is right underneath it. So typically, you've got your hands back here, at a safe distance, which means that that's not always held securely. The board's warped a little bit, and it's not laying nice and flat. So you can't always expect to have the bottom of that groove to be the same depth all the way, and that'll really throw you off when it comes time to assembling. So grab yourself one of these. You can set it for the same one for all of them and go through in just a couple of quick passes, and then you've got uniform depth. Hope this helps with your furniture making. If you enjoy my method of work and like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the plane and chisel icon below, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our in-person and online workshops.